Our agenda for today, there are approximately 22 features I will be covering today, and those will be categorized into those 5 functional areas. As you can see from this slide, which is an official GP roadmap slide that's been released by Microsoft, GP is still got a life ahead of it, 2019 being the next release that's scheduled, followed by 2020 plus, obviously going forward years to come. So GP 2018 R2, which you can see in the 4th block, is the product that we'll be covering today, which was released 1st of October, I think it was, this year, with some ongoing development and features coming in the next few releases. The way that Microsoft at the moment have been developing the product is they've been adding some enhancements to existing functionality, as well as adding some new features that have been requested by the customers and communities of GP around the world. You may also see the last three blocks called Intelligent Edge. Now, I just want to briefly touch on that. So Intelligent Edge is a new cloud solution that Microsoft have with their Dynamics 365 Business Central platform. So that's all cloud enabled, software as a service, and there's a number of tools that are available in that cloud which one can use to leverage one's financial data. That Intelligent Edge actually allows the on-premise versions of Dynamics GP or Dynamics Nav or even Business Central, which will have an on-premise offering, to synchronize the data onto the cloud and be able to use things like Microsoft Flow, Power Apps, etc., to enhance one's reporting capabilities of one's existing data. Now, just bear in mind that having a synchronization of one's data between GP and Business Central, for example, at the moment, I believe it's only the master records that are being synchronized with some summary data, and that's ready to allow one to actually use Power BI and whatnot to actually query and report on that data in the cloud. Obviously, with the product going forward, you should see a lot more enhancements being made, and I wouldn't be surprised if in the future the majority of data in GP is actually synchronized in some way or another into the cloud. Also, bear in mind that if one does have the synchronization or the license for Dynamics 365 Business Central, that subscription is still payable to Microsoft for that service, and one would still be needing to pay their annual licensing fee on the on-premise version as well. If one was to looking at any stage to move to D365 Business Central from Dynamics GP and move wholeheartedly into the cloud, there would be a whole migration and a whole service cost that one would have to look at to actually migrate that data, almost as if it was a whole new implementation. Okay, so based on that, let's move forward. I'm going to cover the first section, which is the financial enhancements that are available in GP 2018 R2, because I will be doing a demo and going through these in more detail. First feature that we look at is the monthly recurring batches. So if any of you are using recurring batches, the new feature that's come out is the option of actually having both monthly and bi-monthly recurring batches have the GL posting date to be the last day of the month. Up until now, the posting date after the first batch is posted would always be 30 days from the posting date of the first invoice and 60 days for a bi-monthly recurring batch. Secondly, a lot of companies use the historical inventory trial balance to reconcile their inventory to the general ledger. Up until now, there was no way of excluding any items that had a zero quantity or zero value, especially with customers with a very large item list. This obviously is a welcomed addition. Transaction level post through general ledger. In a nutshell, that allows users to actually post transactions within GP without a batch at a transaction level and have that resulting journal post all the way through to the general ledger without needing to post the general ledger thereafter. Duplicate check numbers. Now, I know a lot of companies don't use checks any longer, but if one was using check numbers, one can now specify that duplicate check numbers are not allowed, not only in payables management, but in bank rec as well. So for miscellaneous checks and for bank transaction entries. For items at the moment in GP, there's the option to exclude inactive items. That's now been added to checkbooks as well. There's now the option to actually inactivate master records by simply selecting a navigation list for a particular master record, selecting a number of records, and then marking it as inactive. So that's a great new feature that I'll get into a little bit more detail too. Next, we're looking at the purchasing enhancements. So these are enhancements that are specific to the purchasing series in Dynamics GP. So up until now, when one actually went in and created a new payment batch, the default checkbook ID that's set up in the payable setup window does not default automatically, and one actually goes in and do a lookup and select that checkbook on the batch when it's first created. So this feature now allows the checkbook ID to default automatically. Next, the ability to allow partial purchases of purchase requisitions from purchase orders. You can now specify or decrease the quantity that you want to purchase. The addition of the vendor document number to the purchasing all-in-one view, which is that inquiry screen which allows you to view multiple transactions side by side. It's a great inquiry screen which I advise all customers to use. Next, the ability to send purchase orders using an additional format. And lastly, the warning when a vendor is on hold. So that's the purchase enhancements. Next is the sales enhancements. The retain ship to address name with a customer modifier, but that is now standard in Dynamics GP. So for example, you could use the customer modifier to change your debtor ID for a particular customer, and that would update the debtor ID on any transaction or any record in GP's database that relates to that particular debtor ID. Next, there's a new smart list that's available, which will show you any deposits that have been associated with any unposted sales transaction. There's also some additional sort options in the sales order processing item inquiry screen. There's a new option to actually sort and filter by document date, which is a great new feature too. Sales order transaction navigation lists. There's now a print document option, which will allow you to print in both functional or originating currency. Then there's the ability to print and email sales documents at the same time. I think that's probably one of the most liked new features in GP. And next is the ability to email customer statements directly from the debtor maintenance window. Besides doing your normal statement run, you can now go into a particular record for a debtor, and on the debtor maintenance window actually email the statement directly to the customer without having to go wait for your statement cycle. If any of you using workflow, you'll notice there's a lot of transactions that can facilitate or use the workflow functionality, particularly in payables and purchasing in general ledger. But there's also a new one now that's available for sales order processing. So that's a great new addition, which allow you to submit and use the workflow functionality for sales invoices, sales orders, etc. Last but not least is the system enhancements. So there's a couple of features or a few features that are available now from a system level and assist in making things a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more secure. So without any further ado, we are going to move into the GP 2018 R2 demo. Let's jump straight into the financial enhancements. So the monthly and bi-monthly recurring batches, as I previously mentioned, this now gives the ability to create a batch and specify that the posting date will be the last day of the month or the last day of every other month for bi-monthly recurring batches. And these are the three windows that this functionality has now been made available to: the payables batch entry window, the receivables batch entry window, and the inventory batch entry window. So I'm just going to put these all side by side so you can see what these look like. But you'll see now that on any of these batch windows, receivables, for example, I've created a sample one called webinar. For payables, same. And for inventory batch entry, a webinar batch as well. And you'll see now where the frequency field is shown for each of the windows, there's a checkbox now that below, which is called use the last day of the month. And what you'll notice is if I go through and I select that checkbox, notice that the date will change to the last day of the month. So at the moment, this batch, for example, this payables batch was set as the posting date of the 1st of April. If I mark that as to use the last day of the month, it will now become the 30th of April, which is the current month that I'm in, based on my system date. But after my first post, the posting date will then change to the last day of the following month, which would be the 31st of May, and not the 30th of May as it would currently do. Currently, it would be 30 days exactly from the date of the existing posting date, but now it will be obviously the last day of the month. The same applies for bi-monthly. Currently, it's 60 days from the posting date, but using the last day of the month will always be the last day of each subsequent bi-monthly period. Okay, so next we will look at the ability to exclude items on the historical inventory trial balance report. So if I go into the HITB report, I've created a demo report with some options here. And the first thing you may notice is that there's two new checkboxes that are showing here below below these options, and that is to include items with a zero quantity or items with a zero value. I know this is particularly useful for a number of customers ours that have thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of items, in fact, and they don't want to go through and see all these items that have no quantities on hand or with zero values. Now you have the option of excluding those from your list. It's a welcome new addition to the HITB report, and I think that will certainly help users with reconciling to GL a lot more easier and simpler. One thing to bear in mind, depending on your valuation method you're using, because of cost variances that may occur, it is possible to have items with a zero quantity, but that still have a zero value. So you may need to just play around with those settings just to make sure you're getting all the records that are being returned before you switch those off. Transaction level post to GL. This is probably my favorite enhancement or feature that's been released in GP 2018 R2. A lot of customers choose not to use batches to post transactions. I've always advised against it, and I've always tried to insist on using batch level posting rather than transaction level posting. And that was purely because if one is posting at transaction level, meaning you're entering a transaction, not saving as a batch, but you're clicking the post button on that transaction screen, it would always post through the subledger, but the resulting journal would always end up as an unposted journal in your general ledger, which would require a user to then post that journal to post it through the general ledger thereafter. The problem with that is a user could go and modify that journal, or they could go and accidentally delete it, which obviously would end up with an imbalance between your subledger and your general ledger. So this new option allows you now to actually post without a batch at transaction level, but the resulting journal will actually post all the way through to the general ledger, just like a batch does. The windows that are now available for this option to occur, where you can click the post button on the screen, is all these windows in the sales series, purchasing series, and an inventory. I'll just quickly go through some of them. I'm going to go through all of them. A lot of them may not be applicable, but for definitely, for example, the cash receipts entry window, where you're posting payments from customers, clicking the post without a batch, that logic would apply. Receivables transaction entry, if you're doing invoices or debit memos, credit memos, or returns, same logic applies. No batch ID, enter a transaction, click post, post all the way through the general ledger. Same with your SOP sales order processing module, sales transaction entry. Same thing applies for returns invoices. Clicking the post button, no batch, same logic. Purchasing, receiving transaction entry that I spoke about before. Creating a shipment or a shipment invoice, one can post again without a batch, using the post button and posting all the way through the general ledger. And also if one was doing three-way matching, same applies with the purchasing invoice entry window, as well as for any payables transaction entries that one is processing. So literally any screen that I've listed here that has a post button on the transaction screen, one can use that new functionality to post all the way through to the general ledger. In inventory, we've got the assembly entry for bill of materials, stock adjustments, or stock transfers. So as I mentioned before, possibly my favorite feature. I think that's going to be something that a lot of customers may even upgrade to just because of that feature. Next, we're going to look at the ability to prevent duplicate check numbers. So in the checkbook maintenance window, this is a field that's been there for some time, the duplicate check numbers checkbox. With that unmarked, currently that will prevent any payables transactions that are processing payables checks, would not allow the check to have a duplicate number, but only in that module. It didn't apply to the bank rec module, where you may be doing a bank transaction entry, or if you're cutting a check through the miscellaneous window. So now these two windows, bank transaction entry, that logic will apply to that. You will not be able to use a duplicate check number in this transaction screen, as well as in the miscellaneous check window. So if you're using either of those two, you can be rest assured now that the ability to create a duplicate check would not be allowed if that option has been set up accordingly. A fifth point we'll look at in the financial enhancement series is the ability to not display inactive checkbooks in the lookups. So as I mentioned before, in the inventory, for items, you have that ability already to exclude inactive items, but they've now rolled this out to checkbooks as well. So the checkbook lookup window which is available on any screen that has the checkbook ID field available with a magnifying glass or a lookup button next to the field. One can now go into the view, drop-down view, specify that you want to exclude inactive checkbooks. So in the case where you may have, we've got a customer who's got 80 checkbooks, a number of them being credit cards, and a number of those are inactive that they do not want to see when they're doing a lookup. Obviously, that's going to reduce your list, allow you to choose the correct checkbook without accidentally selecting one that was inactive. So by checking that option, you can now exclude the checkbooks, and you can also set that as the default view. So therefore, thereafter, any lookup you do for a checkbook ID may or may not include inactive checkbooks. A couple of windows where that lookup is applicable would be, say, for example, the checkbook ID window. If I did a lookup, this is the lookup window that I previously had open. Once again, we've got the ability to exclude inactive checkbooks. And as you can see from this example, it's automatically ticked because I've set this as my default view. That would also apply for, say, you're doing a payables manual payment entry. If I did a lookup against the checkbook ID, the same logic applies. And the last feature for financial enhancements is the ability to inactivate multiple master records from your navigation lists. So if I went, these are all the master record navigation lists where one can inactivate these master records from. So one can mass update accounts and make them inactive, checkbooks, debtors, salespeople, creditors, employees, and items. So I'll just quickly go to, let's look at debtors, for example. I can go into the debtors navigation list. Once again, I could use the standard features that are available and filter the list of records that I want. I could mark them all, or I can select a subset of those particular debtors. And I could then go and mark these as inactive. You'll see there's a new button that's available up in the menu that's called Inactivate. And one can go through and simply click on Inactivate, which will process those particular records and change their status to inactive. If there's any errors that are reported, GP will give you the ability to print a report that will show you more details as to why those records were not able to be inactivated, and there may be some reasons why that GP's normal business logic will not allow, even if you did it through the front end on each master record. So if I try to inactivate these three, for example, you'll see that 3 have failed. It's given me a notification there from where I can print a report to screen, for example, that will show me some more details as to why this record cannot be inactivated. And in this case, these 3 records have transactions and therefore cannot be inactivated. So the normal business logic still apply and will be adhered to when trying to process those inactivations. So that applies for not only for debtors, but obviously we could look at accounts, the accounts navigation list. Same logic applies. If I select multiple records, I can go in and click on the Inactivate button. Now, bear in mind, up until now, any one of these master records, if I wanted to inactivate them, I'd actually have to open up the master record for it. Say, for example, the debtor maintenance window, select a record, and then go in and click the inactive checkbox. That was the only way one could do it. So you can imagine if you've got several thousand items, for example, and you need to inactivate them all, you would have to go through each one or create a macro. I even know of some customers that go through the back end and try and do that, but that obviously is not the correct way to do it because there is business logic involved. I could go through the back end and mark all the records inactive, but if I try to do it through the front end, it would fail. So one really should be using this feature definitely if one was inactivating any of these master records. So just to reiterate, if you aren't using navigation lists already, I suggest this is a great feature now to start actually using those navigation lists, not only for inactivating your records, but obviously for processing transactions, doing queries, etc. Okay, so that covers the financial enhancements series. Next, we're going to look at the purchasing enhancements, and there's 5 features I'd like to cover here. The ability to default your checkbook ID on computer check batches. So there's a number of screens applicable. Now, first of all, if one was to set up the default checkbook ID, it will be done through the payables management setup window, where one can specify which is your default checkbook if you had more than one. And at the time of actually processing a payment, you could specify that that checkbook ID would default when creating a payment batch. And these are the windows that are available to actually go into and actually create your payment batch. So your traditional building payment batch, where you can go in and select a batch. Say, for example, if I was going to create one called test, for example, as soon as I go add, it'll create the batch ID with the origin of computer check. And whenever this origin is computer check, the functionality will kick in and automatically update the checkbook ID with the checkbook ID field that's set up in your payables management setup window as your default. Up until now, that would default as blank, and you would actually have to go in and actually do a lookup and find your checkbook and specify it each time. So that could obviously save you some time now when processing computer checks. The other windows where that would apply, the editing of payment batch checks. So this is another window from whence you can actually create a batch ID. So if I create one called test, same logic applies. I can open up the batch entry window, and it would automatically default as a computer check with the checkbook ID default. And the edit vendor payment window, where if I've already created a batch or a payment, I could go in and actually call up that batch ID or enter a batch ID. And once again, origin computer check, and the default is populated. I'm sure that's something that all users that are currently using GP could use. So the next next feature I'm going to look at is the ability to allow the purchase of the partial purchase of quantities that have originated from a requisition. So I have a requisition that I've already created, for example. So let's just say there's some users have created some requisitions, whether they've been done manually through the front end here in the purchase requisition entry screen, or whether using the web client and are using the requisition management web client functionality. Once their requisition is created, a user can then consolidate those requisitions into a single purchase order, or could just create a purchase order from a single requisition if they wished. Up until now, if that requisition had a quantity on it that was, say, 10, and you wanted to create the purchase order, but you wanted to say, no, I don't want to order 10, I only want to order 6, that was not possible. But now with this new feature, if I call up this requisition, which I've already created for a quantity of 10, if I attempt to purchase that particular requisition, you will now see that in the item tab, I have the ability to actually amend that, and I could change it to a quantity that's less than what was requested. So let's just say I put in a quantity of 6 instead. That's all I want to purchase, and I tab off that field. A message will pop up telling you that the remaining quantity ordered will be cancelled. So that's great, great new feature. Obviously, there were some limitations before, but that has now been fixed, and that feature is a great new addition to GP 2018 R2, and I'm sure can be utilized by customers going forward. The other thing to note is that once this requisition has been created in a purchase order and processed, the requisition, if all the line items on that requisition have either been fully ordered or cancelled, that will then move that requisition to history. Third feature in the purchasing enhancement series is the addition of the vendor document number to the purchasing all-in-one view. So as I mentioned before, a lot of customers are not actually using this, but I suggest you do. It's great for if you're looking at payments and you wanted to see what payment what was that payment applied against? What was the document number that it was applied against? Not necessarily the voucher number, which you can currently see, but the actual document number that it was applied to. Which invoice was it applied to? So if I search for a record that I've already created previously for a travel company, you will see that this is a payment that was processed previously for an invoice. Now, if I click on the drop-down list, you will now see this new block that's available, which shows the applied to document number. So that's great to now easily see what document number or invoice number that was applied against. Obviously, most of the time you guys are dealing with document numbers. That's really what you're looking for. The voucher number doesn't really mean much to a supplier or perhaps to yourself. So the document number is definitely the field that probably makes more sense. And based on that is one of the customer requests that came in prior to GP 2018 R2 being enhanced, and that was one of the requests that came through from multiple customers, and therefore was added to Dynamics GP 2018 R2. Okay, next we're going to look at the ability to actually send or email a purchase order using more than one template or format. Currently, you only have the ability to use the blank form or the blank paper form in order to email purchase orders. But let's just say you had two different layouts, and depending on what purchase order you're emailing, you might want to just choose one or the other. So this gives you the option. So, for example, from the purchase order entry window, you can now go into the email purchase order send email options window, and now have the ability to select either the blank paper form or the other form. Now, either of these could be customized differently. One could have each one could have a different logo on, for example, especially if you had two entities, for example, and you wanted to send a purchase order for that one particular entity rather than the other. That functionality is also available when one is doing a purchase order processing document inquiry. So let's just say we were looking at a particular list of purchase orders for a particular supplier or for a particular date. One could then do a zoom in on that purchase order and go into the email options, purchase order send email options window again, and there again you can see you have the ability to select one of those two formats. So that's also another great new addition. I'm sure there will probably be more that will be added down the track, but that's a welcomed addition to GP 2018 R2 too. So that concludes the purchasing enhancements features. Next we'll look at the sales enhancement features, and we'll kick off of those 6 features that I'll be covering with the retain ship to address name with customer modifier. If one was to use the customer combiner and modifier window, and let's just say I had a particular customer that I wanted to modify. Let's just say this one here, Advanced Tech Satellite Systems. If I wanted to change this to Advanced 0002, for example, this would now go through GP, and wherever there's a record related to customer ID Advanced 002, it would now change that debtor ID. The problem up until now was when we ran this process and we did the modification, which I'm doing now. I'll just show you the output that shows that it's been successfully modified. If I went into that record now for that debtor, so now instead of selecting Advanced 002, which it was before, and I now choose 0002, you can see that this record has now been modified. But previously, up until GP 2018 R2, this particular ship to address name field, which is a name that you've given to this particular location for the customer, would be blank. So this now has been resolved and enhanced, and it now no longer does that, and that ship to address name from the previous debtor ID will now come across to the new modified debtor address ID. Okay. Next feature is the new smart list that we made available for deposits that are associated with unposted sales transactions. So let's just say one was doing a sales transaction. Let's just say you're doing a sales order, and the customer that you were processing this for had made a deposit. So I'll just go and put in a random item here. So there's a shortage. I'm just going to override that shortage, override the credit limit. And let's just say I went in and did a deposit here of $1,000. Well, let's make it $1,000. That's the deposit they put down. Now, once again, I could say, yep, it's a cash receipt, so I'm going to insert that in there. Standard GP functionality, and let's save that. Save that in the batch. So now, if I save that transaction, GP standard functionality will now process that deposit and post it through the subledger and to the general ledger. But it would be very difficult for me to now run a report and say, what was that deposit? Which orders have had deposits recorded against them? This new smart list report that's available now will list those transactions. So let me just expand this quickly and make this a bit larger. So you'll see now that this under sales transactions is a new smart list called deposits on unposted sales transactions. And this will now list any deposits that have been associated with an unposted sales transaction. And from here, I can then drill back to that transaction. And once again, I can see there was my payment or my deposit. So that's a great new addition, and that smart list to GP 2018 R2. Third feature in the sales enhancement series I'm going to look at is the additional sort options when doing a sales order processing item inquiry. So I'm sure this is a window that a lot of you would use. Typically, I'd go through and I could use a number of these filters to filter what I want to actually see in my scrolling window. But you'll notice there's a new field that's been made available called by document date. So these three that were there before were available, but not the by document date, which obviously is something that you could really limit the records that you're viewing in your scrolling window and therefore find what you're looking for. There's also this sort by option, which you wouldn't have seen before. This now gives you the option to sort this information that's been filtered, say by document date, to be sorted by any one of these 5 fields: document number, document type, item number, document date, or debtor ID, and you can sort them by either ascending or descending order. Obviously, once you set up your criteria, click on redisplay, it will then sort or filter your records and sort them accordingly. So I think that's a great new feature too. Feature 4 under sales enhancements is the sales order transaction navigation list that allows us to print documents in functional and originating currency. So I'll go to that navigation list quickly. I will call up a transaction or select a transaction and show you that feature. So let's just say we were going to print this invoice, but we wanted to print this invoice not only in its originating currency, which is currently the case, but you can now specify to also print the functional currency in the currency to print. So that whole new block is new in GP 2018 R2. Okay, and there's a number of windows one can do that from, but ultimately that's the ability now to actually print in multi-currencies or in originating in functional currency. So moving on, print and emailing sales documents at the same time. So this is a really great feature that's been made available. Let's say, for example, you had created a sales transaction entry, an invoice, and you wanted to email this, but not only did you want to email this, but you wanted to print it at the same time. This one's already been approved, it's gone through the workflow. So this one now, I can actually go into the sales document print options screen, which you would normally do currently. Select the invoice that you want to, that's an invoice you want to process. Select the format or the layout you want to print. And you can now select the checkbox to print and to send a document and email. Obviously, in this case, this is doing it one invoice at a time. If you wanted to bulk print and email, you could use the print sales documents window. The same logic applies where you're going to be printing, say, invoices. You could select a range of invoices you wanted to print, and now you could say that the destination is either print documents and or send documents in email. Previously, you would have to print one and then come in and then do or email first and then come back in and print the same records thereafter. So this is a great new feature that's available too, and I'm sure you will use that functionality going forward. Lastly, but not leastly, on the sales enhancement series is the ability to send emails by email to customers, customer statements to customers directly from their data maintenance window. So if I go to the data maintenance window, and I want to print a customer statement outside of the normal statement cycle, I could simply go in and click on the email button, and that will go through, obviously, depending on whether or not you've got it set up for emailing. It will now go through and email that customer statement directly to the customer from the data maintenance window. Okay, so that's just a confirmation that the statement has been successfully created and emailed. Okay, and just one more thing to bear in mind, that this is your normal area where you'd normally send your statements, but the statement ID that's going to be always used by the emailing functionality is the blank form. If the blank form does not exist, GP will create that automatically when attempting to email customer statements from the data maintenance window. Next, we've got the workflow, the new workflow functionality, which is for sales transactions. There's a number of workflows that are already available for purchasing, payables, general ledger, and receivables, but you now also have the ability for sales transactions, obviously SOP entries. So you'll see that in the workflow, there's now under the sales series, we have this new sales transaction approval workflow that's available. I've created a demo one for our webinar, and I've created a very basic step which requires all invoices to be, or all sales transactions to be submitted for approval, but one can obviously use standard functionality and use a lot of different limiting criteria based on dates, who the customer is, whether they're on hold, based on invoice amounts, etc., for the need to approve workflows. There's also a message that is available, a default message template that will be sent through to the approver, and that is the assign SOP approval message, which can be modified or used accordingly. And if I was in my sales transaction entry, as I showed you earlier, that last one I just created, it had a submit button because it has not been submitted for approval. But if I were to click the submit button, that would then go into the queue and be submitted to whoever that approver is in the workflow. Standard functionality, you can see the history of that workflow, where it originated, and what the first step was, and who it's been sent to for approval. Okay, so that's workflow for SOP. Last but not least, we have 4 enhancements for the system enhancements for system module. So we've got the password maximum length. When one is creating a new user in GP, up until now, you had a limit of the number of characters you could use. It was only 15 characters. It's now been increased to 21, which now conforms with the number of characters in SQL Server itself. So obviously, when this record is created, this user ID is created, it actually creates a record in SQL Server. And now this will give you some added security with the length of your passwords being increased. The next feature is the password expiration notification. Now, there's no specific area in GP to set that up. It's automatically done. If it's set up in SQL Server where you've got a password policy in place and there's an expiration date, you would automatically receive a message within GP when logging in that your password is to expire in 7 days, and it gives you the option of saying whether or not you want to change it right then and there. Business Analyzer, you may have seen earlier when I switched this off. If I had this switched on and I didn't have my SSRS reports deployed, or had some KPIs I didn't have access to, on my navigation list windows, I may get some error message when it's trying to populate the Business Analyzer windows with those SSRS reports. You'll get an error. You could go OK and continue past that error, but that error would appear each time for each user. So now you have the ability to actually switch this off company-wide or system-wide for all users and for all navigation lists from your home page. So you could have your business analyzer KPIs on your home page in GP or in your navigation lists, and now you can switch them off automatically for all users and for all lists. Last but not least, there's the ability to have Smart List Designer in your favorites. So, for example, if I had a Smart List that I'd created in Smart List Designer, a custom one, and I went into my Smart List favorites, up until now, those Smart List Designer reports would not be listed here, and I wouldn't be able to run them without going in Smart List. Now you have the option of all those Smart List Designer Smart Lists would now appear in your Smart List favorite list, and from here you could then select the Smart List and run it without actually having to open up the Smart List window itself.